All right, good afternoon, Dad.
Good afternoon.
Today is Saturday, August 23rd, and you are back home. So,
I,
welcome home.
I sure am.
So, yeah, maybe we can just start by you telling us a little bit about your trip. I want to know, how do Russians treat you when they find out you're an American?
Without exception, I've never had a hostile response, and I've never had a shocked response. Generally, the response is very friendly, and sometimes just neutral. That's the range, neutral to very warm, but never any hostility. And again, my experience is more limited, but your sister has been there for 5 years now. And has it really been that long? Yeah, I think that's right. She's been in Moscow for 5 years, and she really can't report any sort of hostility
Do you
directed at
find
her
that
because.
do you find that a
Go
little
ahead.
odd? Do you think that's a little strange? I mean,
Uh,
it's
right.
great, it's great,
Yeah.
but it just seems like we're essentially at war with Russia, and our generals are directing Ukrainian troops to kill Russian soldiers. We're supporting the Ukrainian regime, which is sending in drones to target civilians almost daily. Um, I feel like I might be a little upset if I was on that side. So is it kind
Right.
of do you find that a little
Well,
bit odd?
no, I wouldn't. I don't find it odd. I think first of all, the great majority of Russians make the distinction between the government of this country and the people of this country, and they understand that these are decisions taken by the U.S. government, not decisions made by the U.S. people. And then I think also they understand that Americans that are there in Russia are generally going to be Americans who are friendly to Russia. The Russia haters are not going to be in Russia by and large. I think very rarely. So I'm not surprised by that. Inevitably you're going to come across somebody who is just hates Americans. That's going to happen in any country. There are always individuals like that, but so far we haven't, and your sister hasn't run across such people.
So do you think that Americans hate Russians more than Russians hate Americans, even though we're the ones that are over there and on their next door?
um, it's possible. I mean, it's probably more likely in Europe. I think like the anti-Russian propaganda is pretty intense in Europe, more intense than it is in the United States. And a lot of that propaganda really does cross the boundaries from, let's say, political disagreement, opposition to Russian policies, into outright hatred of Russians and all things Russian, Russian culture. Um, Certainly, you find that in Ukraine, but not just in Ukraine. You find that in Europe. So I think there is some actual hatred of Russians. I don't know how widespread it is, but there is actual hatred of Russians, really fostered by government propaganda in the West.
Do you know what the general feeling is that Russia has towards the Ukrainians? Do they see them as this enemy, and the average everyday Ukrainian soldier, or do they realize
No,
that a lot of them are fighting against their will?
uh-huh. No, they in general regard them as brothers. They again, the Ukrainian language, which is spoken in the west of Ukraine, is really a dialect of Russian. I don't think Ukrainians like to hear that, but it's very, very similar to Russian. And I think it could be very fairly described as a dialect. And, the culture, they share so much in common. They are brothers, and that's how Putin recently described them. He says this war is a tragedy because it's really a war between brothers. I remember your sister telling me that this was prior to the war, but I don't think anything's really changed since then. But that, for example, in a bar, if there was a soccer match and you could see it was the Ukrainian team against some other team, this was a bar in Moscow or any other place in Russia, the Russians would invariably cheer for the Ukrainians. This was even after the 2014 coup, when there was so much, already very anti-Russian rhetoric and policies coming out of Ukraine. But they recognize them as brothers. And then in Russia, there are many, many Ukrainians, and many, many Russians have, Ukrainian relatives or, or ancestors. There's the connections to Ukraine are numerous and often very, very deep. So there isn't, I think there's an effort. I know there is an effort to portray or to explain Russia's attack, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine as motivated by some sort of racial hatred. And it just couldn't be farther from the truth.
Yeah, but at the same time, Russia is engaging in a war of attrition. They have adopted the strategy very effectively to just demolish the Ukrainian army, which means a huge loss of life. We talk about one, we were talking about that leak, of a potentially 1.7 million dead and missing Ukrainian soldiers. So, it's, I understand the sentiment and I understand the ties, but it just, if you have a fraternal relationship, isn't there any other way? I mean, I guess Putin doesn't think so, but it just seems like it's such a huge cost.
Right.
1.7 million people that you are saying that traditionally and culturally, historically, these are brotherly people, and we've even heard that language from, I believe, was it, Zaluzhny said something like, we are brotherly people after all, in a reference to a terrorist attack. But there is this kind of acknowledgement, that there is this tie. So do you think that this was the best way, a moral way?
Yeah, no, it is hard to say. I had very mixed feelings about the war when it first broke out. And I still do to some extent, just wonder if it really, let's say, if the Russian government, if Putin knew, what would follow. Again, clearly it was an attempt to bring the Ukrainians to the negotiating table, and it succeeded in that way. They negotiated. They actually got the draft agreement. There was a chance that this much less than full scale invasion was going to succeed, and but it failed. It was sabotage, as we well know, by the Americans and the British, and then we ended up with a full scale war. This was a war that the Russians hadn't planned for or prepared for. That's why they had to withdraw from the Kharkov region and a part of the Kherson region too. But now they have a full scale war in their hands, and I think it's really hard to say. I guess this is the argument that you can make that again the Russians. This is the argument that the Russians do make, and that is that there was an existential threat. They could see it coming, and they believed, and there's evidence to support this belief that the Ukrainians were preparing to attack, to retake the Donbass, and that more than that, again, NATO had declared its intention to bring Ukraine to make it a member state. And as Lavrov pointed out, we'll see, they become a member state, and then any kind of border conflict can happen. And again, with the kind of people running the show in Ukraine, it's almost inevitably going to happen. And then it's Article 5, and then right then Russia's at war with all of NATO. And this is something the risk that they just could not take. As Putin put it, he's like every Russian, he's acutely aware of the horrendous losses that the Soviet Union, and which is, Russia, Russia being the largest republic by far within the Soviet Union, suffered during that war. 27 million dead. Again, that's such an astronomical number, and it's so far beyond anything that the U.S. suffered that we can't really even understand it. But it's something that is just ever present. And he said, he felt like this was his duty. This could not happen again, and he was afraid that this is what going to happen again. That threat was coming from the West, and it came through Ukraine. This is kind of historical. That's kind of the corridor of attacks from the West. And then in this case, not only was this threat brewing in Ukraine, but we had actual Nazis that were growing in power and, in influence within government. This isn't just not made up pretend Nazis like we have in the West, but actual Nazis, people that identified, maybe again, it's more accurate to call them Banderites, but those Banderites are people that fought the Soviet Union, during World War II, and they saw it as their duty to fight them again, and they were growing in power, and so it was just, you can understand, I stop and think about it, try to put myself in the shoes of Putin or of any Russian government official, and they say, this is something that we cannot risk. Now, again, the costs have been huge. It's just true. We don't know the exact number. That 1.7 million might be true, but some of the names, I think some of the data has been released, but not, we're only talking a very small amount. So we won't really know unless the hackers choose to publish everything, and then we can know for sure. But in any case, the number is very high, and it's been the cost in human lives and suffering, the destruction of these entire cities. It's a huge, huge cost.
Right. Yeah. When we talk about the conflict on such a regular basis, you kind of just get into this day-to-day almost grind of following the conflict.
Right.
But then when you step back and take a look at it, you're like, oh my God, are we talking about, before this is all said and done, 2 million people, dead? And you wonder, like, was this the only way to, get security to end this conflict? Part of me, I'm doing Monday morning quarterbacking now, looking at it and just saying, like, if you knew that it was going to cost 2 million, you'd have to kill 2 million Ukrainians to get this done, and, lose hundreds of thousands potentially yourself. Maybe the better option would have been to use things like the Attrition to go for decapitation strikes. You're talking about, we have real Nazis coming into power into Ukraine, this Banderite threat. Decapitate that threat, and there was that Lukashenko apparently was all for using Attritionics in Kiev, and Putin vetoed it. And then you're thinking, like, well, maybe the moral position would have been to do that. You show an overwhelming force and technology through using this type of weaponry power. Maybe you don't kill Zelensky or the Banderites, but you scare the pants off of them and say, look, you can't hide anywhere you're going. These things, you can't stop them. We're coming for you. So Come to the table. We've got to get to this deal done. And none of the security guarantees. You got to face reality. You can't hide behind the skirts of the United States and the European Union. That maybe that was just the way to go about. Of course, I understand the risks of escalation, but a slow war grind for 3 years, we see continual escalation. That also has its risk. So, I'm not saying that I would have done a better job or would have, would have known what to do, but just looking at it for me now, I'm just thinking, like, maybe that would have been the right decision to make from the beginning. Is you have to go through hard and go through decapitation strikes, because the tragedy is that you're saying that these are brotherly people that, a lot of Budanov himself, right, the head of the secret intelligence of Ukraine, I think his grandparents live in Russia. This is, I'm sure in this war there have been kin fighting kin. I'm sure some of them are in the front line. Like, you have a cousin that's across the border and he's on the other side. Like, this is a brother fighting brother thing.
Yeah. Well, like the head of the Ukrainian army, of the Ukrainian armed forces, General Syrskyi, has close relatives living in Russia right now.
Right. So it just feels like...
Yeah, well, I understand the argument, and I've heard others make it, like Jim Jatras, for example, who was used to work for the U.S. State Department. And he said he thinks, he thinks the more moral thing to do is to take the gloves off and just bring the war to a speedy conclusion. And, others have made the same case. And I can understand it. I guess on the other hand, there are risks. And he admits there are risks. You do that and it could provoke some kind of reaction, that bring in NATO directly or something, There is a risk of doing that. But, a lot of lives are being lost. We talk about it as though, as it's just some sort of abstraction, as like accumulating points in a game. But when you're talking about attrition, you're talking about killing people. That's a big part of it. Destroying equipment and killing men. And if it's not 1.7 million, it's the number's still awfully big. And
it's so large, it's hard to comprehend that. There was, I don't know if you saw the news report, there's some cardinal in Italy that read off the names of all the children that have perished in Gaza. Mm-hmm. I think he read something like 12,000 names. 12,000, mm-hmm. That's a lot. I mean, compare that to a million. It took him over 7 hours just to read the names of these kids. And, that's, just think about that. That's that's children. That was only 12,000. Sure, mm-hmm. These aren't children that are being targeted, civilians, or these are soldiers, but we're talking about over 1 million. That is just, if you put that into perspective, that it took 7 hours to read 12,000 names, when you're like, oh my God, 1 million, like all these people, who's going to remember them? Who's going to pick up the pieces of all their broken families? Right. Just the cost is just unbelievably high.
Right. No, it really is. I mean, that's okay for every soldier that's lost, that dies. There's a grieving wife, grieving brothers and sisters, parents, children. The suffering is enormous. It's incalculable. But since you just mentioned Gaza in contrast, I think at the same time we need to point out the huge contrast between these two wars. Recently there was actually a study that was done by both Israeli media and I believe it was The Guardian in Britain, where they got actually authoritative data from the IDF on, the percentage of Hamas militants that are killed out of the total killed so far. Which is probably an undercount, but let's just go with it. We're talking a little bit over 60,000, the official number of people directly killed in the conflict. Well, according to the IDF, of that, more than 60,000, 8,900 were Hamas. All the rest were just civilians. So we're talking about 83% of the people killed in Gaza by the IDF are civilians. Now, in Ukraine, it's actually quite extraordinary. I just double-checked the figures. According to the UN, as of the end of last month, 13,900 civilians have been killed in the conflict in Ukraine. Now, we don't know the number of soldiers, but let's kind of, at the lower end, I'll say 300,000 total dead. And if that's the case, then we're talking about approximately 4% of the people killed are civilians. And then at higher, I'm not even going to go with the 1.7 million figure. I'm going to go much lower. We'll say 1.2 million at a higher end. That's 1%. I mean, the contrast is extraordinary. And it's actually, the Gaza has been unusually cruel. The war, the IDF in Gaza has been unusually cruel to civilians. Typically in a war, it's somewhere around, in the last century or so, something like 50% of the casualties have been civilians. Now, there's a reason for that in the past, is that you had these bombing campaigns, and all the bombs back then were dumb. You would aim for a factory, you'd have to drop 100 bombs for one of the bombs to hit the factory. And then the other 99, land on apartment buildings and on people's houses and so forth. So, I mean, that's part of the reason. It's just that, again, you didn't have smart weapons. So really with the smart weapons that the Israelis have, but often they choose not to use, they've actually chosen to use the dumb bombs because I think it's clear they just don't care about civilian casualties. So they're at 83%, and that's historically high. I think it's much higher than any other conflict in the last century or so. But that 1% or to 4% for Ukraine is extraordinarily low. And I think that tells you a lot about how the Russians are going about this war. Now, remember, with that killed, a fairly significant percentage of that are going to be Russians living in Russian territory, are going to be, are actually Russians on the Russian side of the line and being killed by IDF artillery strikes, and more often than not drones or HIMARS.
No, not IDF. I mean Ukrainian.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. Getting the two conflicts right. Ukrainian, right? So it's actual killed by Russians, and the Russians that are okay, those Ukrainians, so-called Ukrainians that are killed, civilians, my bet is that the majority of them are actually pro-Russian Ukrainians, Russian speakers that are waiting for the Russian army to come and are staying in their houses and therefore putting themselves at risk. Those are the people who are dying in that. But again, 1 to 4% compared to 83%.
Yeah, and
I mean, that just there tells you these are two very, very different wars. But you're right. We shouldn't, because of that, somehow think it's okay. It's that soldiers are dying. Yeah, there's a particular horror about, the death of innocent civilians, especially children and, women and children. But the death of a soldier, even though he's out there, it's within the rules of the game. It's still a tragedy, and we shouldn't forget that.
right. Yeah. With the Gaza number 83% as well, I imagine if that's Israel's number, their definition of a Hamas member is pretty broad. It could be just, so I imagine the reality, yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if it's over 90%. Right. I mean, it's just what we see. We just see it's just complete destruction. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can go over to Gaza, or let me just follow up just to finish up with Russia. So, I mean, we've talked about this fraternal kind of relationship between Ukraine and Russia, but after killing the amount of death and destruction from this war, the amount of killing, do you think that they could become fraternal peoples again, that this hatchet can be buried? This is something that I think maybe a consequence of the cold calculation of engaging in a war of attrition, could be an outcome of it. It's like, well, yeah, now you have created this animosity as well. Maybe if you focused on targeting the leadership and Banderites exclusively, people that were openly promoting their neo-Nazi elements and their hatred of just wanting to kill Russians and just wanting to kill them, you could have been able to win people over more. And I'm just afraid now with this amount of death, can it heal? I don't know. I mean, you see history, you see Japan, we dropped 2 atom bombs on them and then they're like, okay, but.
Right. And the same thing in Germany. There can be healing, but there is a risk. Again, there's especially a risk of, if there is any hatred of Ukrainians, in Russia, it's the hatred of the Banderites. I think there is, because they understand that these are people that actually seem to take pleasure in and have dedicated their lives to killing Russians, not just soldiers, but all kinds of Russians. And so there is real hatred of the Banderites. And, at the end, if we end up with a kind of a Banderite rump state, well, I think there's clearly going to be hatred between the Banderite rump state and Russia on both sides. Now, one big question is, like, what will happen in those sort of in-between areas, like Kiev, for example, where I think, many of the speakers are Russian, but they have sort of a mixed Russian-Ukrainian identity. How much have they been affected by the propaganda in the last several years? But could they change? Are they have they actually, are they beyond salvaging at this point? Could they, sometimes it's just like when the authorities that have been shaping your views is overthrown, then people can change their views. They're freed from those pressures, and they can even understand, like, why the Russians, even accept, the Russian missile destroyed the factory where I worked, and my brother was killed by the Russians, but they were fighting this war not because they hated me, but they had to overthrow the people that ruled over us. And now we understand, who they were. We kind of understood before, but now we see it even more clearly. It's, that's a hard thing to say, how it's all going to turn out. But you're right, through a long war of attrition, you do run the risk of sowing, the seeds of hatred. And that's something that could last for generations. But but not necessarily so. Again, it's just you provided the counter examples, and I think And there is a fact, just that I pulled out that remarkable statistic, the very, very low level of civilian casualties. It seems like if you're a Ukrainian, you have to notice that. They're not just trying to kill us all. They're fighting a war against soldiers that are trying to kill them. That's a different thing.
Yeah. Well, if there does come a point where the hatchet is buried and they're able to restore relationships and once again be brotherly peoples, I think that could only come about if the Ukrainians realize that it was the fault of the West, that they were led down the primrose path, that all this death and destruction, we can't be blaming the Russians for it anymore. They have to blame somebody, and they would put their blame at the feet of people like Zelensky, Biden, Boris Johnson, all these the Western leaders that promised them just riches and I don't know, progressive parades or whatever it is they're hoping with becoming part of NATO and the EU. I think that's where it would have to go, right? If we do reach that point where things between Ukraine and Russia normalize, I think that the hatred would have to, it won't disappear. I think it's just going to be redirected to the natural correct course. And
right. Well, you can actually see a shift in that direction and a growing gap between the people in Ukraine and the government. The government led by, Zelensky and his clique have not changed, haven't budged a bit. They're still insisting on, total victory and reparations and war crimes trials for Putin, all this kind of stuff. They want Crimea back. But the polls show, initially the people actually supported him in that. It was something like 75%, 80% said, yeah, we've got to fight this war and win it. But now, and only a small percentage said we should negotiate a settlement. But now the figures are reversed. Again, the great majority are saying, hey, we need to negotiate. That's what the people are saying. And it's only a small percentage, or like 20, 25% are saying, no, we have to go all the way and win this war. So there has been a shift, and, maybe gradually people will come to that conclusion, as this gap between the government and the governed, grows in Ukraine. They increasingly, Ukrainians are going to regard their own government as the enemy.
Yeah. Okay, let me ask you another question about your stay in Russia. I remember you telling me a while ago that Russia has always been oriented towards the West ever since its existence until really the past 5 years. It's been orienting towards to the east, towards China and BRICS. So, are you seeing signs of the BRICS relationship, this shift to the east and away from the West in Russia now?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking about the kind of cultural events, for example, that we observed close to the Kremlin. Last year, there was some sort of South African musical festival. And then this year there was a Vietnamese cultural festival. And then you observe the tourists, and it seems by far the largest share are from China now. It's funny. Well, the signs, like in places like Moscow and the tourist areas, will be in 3 languages: Russian, English, and Chinese. If you go to Sochi, where we spent a few days in Sochi, and this was built up, of course, prior to 2014, and this was a chance for, Russia to present its best face to the world and show that, hey, we're part of the first world now. And it didn't work out that way, unfortunately. It was during that time, basically, that the Maidan uprising happened. But the thing, if you go to Sochi now, you notice that there's a lot of English. So many of the signs are in English, but the English-speaking tourists are not there. We were just a very, very unusual minority. Yeah, it's just like that whole, that dream never came true. That was going to be a international resort city that would draw many Westerners in particular, but they're not there. Now, at the other, I think something that it really struck me. I went to a place. We went to a place called Patriot Park outside of Moscow. There is a cathedral that has been built really to commemorate those Russian soldiers that have fallen in the wars of the last century or so. And then there's also a very large museum dedicated to the Great Patriotic War, as the Russians call it, the Second World War. Now there were, I would say, at least 10% of the people there. This was a very Russian place, but at least 10% of the tourists there were Chinese. And I noticed that, for example, in all the restaurants and other facilities around in the park, there were just two languages, Russian and Chinese. And I was thinking, that struck me. And I think the reason is that this was completed just like 2 or 3 years ago. It's like after the SMO and the new reality had already set in. Hell, we're not going to get many English speaking tourists. It's the Chinese that are coming. So things have, you can see it. It's just, I think everybody understands the way things are going, and they understand too that it's more or less permanent. It's probably at least a generation before anything significant might change.
So it feels like a little sneak peek into the multipolar world. Like this is what it's looking like, huh?
Right.
Was there anything that you missed while you were over there in Russia where you thought, like, man, at least America's got string cheese in a can, something.
Yeah. Well, actually, your sister commented on she likes actually Tennessee barbecue and smoked meats, and those sort of things were hard to find in Russia.
Oh, really? I didn't know she was into that. I
yeah. But anyway, I think overall, the food was quite good, and we ate at some excellent restaurants. I think another thing I just want to comment on is that this is the first time that we went out into some of the smaller cities. The first year we went just to Moscow, then Moscow and St. Petersburg. And people will say, and I've heard this, many times, it's just like, Moscow, that's sort of the showcase city. And, St. Petersburg, yeah, that too. But the rest of Russia, is just a dung heap or third world or something. Well, I can say, that the other cities that we visited were equally civilized and clean and safe and prosperous. That certainly was the impression I got from them. We went to Nizhny Novgorod, just a couple 100 miles to the east of Moscow, and then another few 100 miles east to Kazan, and then down to Sochi, and all of them, were just as clean, safe, and civilized as Moscow is.
That's not what they tell us over here.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. Well, all right. Thanks for that, Dad. Let's move over to Gaza then. So can you tell us what's going on? We had the beginning of the invasion, and then I'm seeing UN reports, clear recognition that we have famine in Gaza, which is something we knew was happening, that there's starvation. How dire is the situation? How is this invasion of Gaza City going?
Okay, well, as far as the starvation, according to the health authorities in Gaza, I believe 270 have died, of starvation so far. And there are many, tens of thousands that are suffering from acute malnutrition. People that, many of them just look like living skeletons. We're talking about not somebody who's just sort of hungry, but people that haven't had enough to eat for months now and are just, really are approaching death, or just are such a weakened state that they can't take care of themselves. And, many of them are in hospitals. Others haven't made it to hospitals. And it is a very dire situation. I was just reading, the Israelis continue to deny that any starvation is taking place. But I just read actually an article in Haaretz said they did. Okay, there are no, it's hard to get, reports out of Gaza because actually the Israelis are not letting any reporters into Gaza, and they have killed, as we know, approximately 200, which is actually a total that exceeds like the total of all the wars in the last 150 years. They have killed 200. journalists. So, again, Haaretz can't get any of its own journalists in there, but what they did is they did a virtual tour of various hospitals, the hospitals that still remain and still function to some extent within Israel.
You mean
And,
within Gaza?
oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, within Gaza, right. Within Gaza. And they said that, it's just horrifying. They showed some images, quite a few. I mean, but it just, the doctors just took them on a virtual tour, from bed to bed, from ward to ward. And there was just, there was just, it seemed like just an endless, well, countless starving children in these wards. And you could see it's a horrible, it's very, very hard to actually to look at it. But they went through it in these different hospitals, and they just said this statement that, there's no starvation in Gaza, again, which the Israeli government insists on. It's just so absurd. And they'll say, well, the ones that have actually died, they had pre-existing conditions. Some of them did, but they almost certainly wouldn't have died if they hadn't been starved to death. And then the majority don't have any pre-existing conditions. There's one thing that you can see in this. There's many cases the family showed pictures of the same child like a year prior, and the child looked fine and was just like a normal kid at age. Now you're talking about like a 2-year-old that only weighs 10 pounds, or a 10-year-old that only weighs 35 pounds, or and you can imagine what they look like. I mean, they look like human skeletons, and they're just apathetic. They can hardly respond. They can only, that's the reality there. So the horror continues, and the aid seekers continue to be killed. So it's like one of these severely malnourished children in the hospital, or I guess it was a young man, he was suffering both from malnutrition, and he had a wound because he had attempted to go to one of these aid stations and got shot. And he had, both a head wound and I think a wound in the gut too. And, he was in a real bad state. And that just gives you right there the kind of the horror that they're living. It's a real nightmare. But now, as far as the operation against Gaza City, Gaza City prior to October 7th had a population of 700,000. And now has a population of 1.2 million, because so many have been driven out from other parts of Gaza, and they're refugees within the city. 1.2 million. And that's, the majority of the remaining population in Gaza. Now they all have to leave. They're being told to head south. They've already, the IDF has already moved up, has kind of completed some of the preliminary operations up to the edges of the city. They've already issued evacuation orders, but they recognize that a lot of these people are not going to flee. And that's what many of them are saying is, look, I've already been evacuated, like a half a dozen times or whatever. And, and I've had enough. I'm just staying. So that's what some of them are saying.
Or they don't have the strength, probably. If you're starving to death, how do you go to walk with your belongings,
right.
Food, water?
And they often find, they're told that there's a safe area. They go to the safe area and then they're attacked, So many of them are going to stay. And again, the IDF recognizes that. So the IDF's plan is that like after they issue the evacuation orders, then they'll start firing artillery at the apartment buildings in Gaza City to encourage, as they put it, the remaining Gaza residents to evacuate. And then again, the Israeli defense minister said that, this is the plan, and the ultimate goal is actually to level all of Gaza City. Again, a city that had a population of 700,000 prior to the war, to level the entire city and make it uninhabitable, and just so that there's just no place for these people to return, and they'll just be sent. It's already, again, Gaza already had a very dense population, very densely populated area. They're going to be forced into even more crowded conditions in the south. And I think it's clear, again, that the hope is to just send them to someplace like South Sudan. Apparently the U.S. government is trying to help the Israelis to find a place to send the Gazans.
It's unbelievable. It's so evil. I can't, it's hard for me to just hearing you telling me about these kids that are starving, just bed after bed of starving children when there's almost an unlimited amount of food just a mile away across the
Yeah,
border.
right,
That it's just exceptionally cruel. I think
right.
even historically, I can't think of anything as cruel and inhumane as what is being done to the people of Gaza now. Just we talk about World War II all the time, the Holocaust. It's like, of course, this was awful. But over 8 million Germans died. They were running out of food too. It's like things were tough for everybody. Not saying and justifying anything, of course, but just the fact is that there is food. There's no reason for this to happen.
Right.
It's not like you have a scarce amount of resources and it's like, okay, we have to feed our own first. It's like, no, it's just intentional. And to do this to children, I mean, I just don't understand. If you're an Israeli and you have a family, you have children, how can you be okay with this? How can you hear what you're saying with like, it breaks my heart. It just hearing that, just these kids that can't eat. I mean,
Right.
it's just, I have little kids, little boys, just thinking like, if you can't feed them, just how
Yeah.
painful it is, just that the crying and just watching them die, and that they're going to be damaged forever, even if you do able to get them food at this point. It's just unconscionably evil. I can't think of anything more horrific, and nobody's doing anything. This is what's so crazy. We all see it. Everybody knows it's happening, and nobody does it. I can't believe the world is letting this happen. I just still can't understand it. Why can't anybody do anything? Why doesn't anybody do anything?
Well, again, the main reason I think is the United States is that here this military superpower is propping them up. I was just reading today that again there's $3.7 billion in emergency military aid. This is on top of everything else that's been given to Israel, has been approved. And much of that actually is interceptors, because so many of them were used up in the war with Iran. They're trying to get them to replenish their stocks of interceptors, but other munitions that are being used in Gaza too. It's just that it's the U.S. If the U.S. wasn't supporting Israel, this would never happen. Even if it couldn't go very far. I think it was just other countries would be much more willing to maybe engage the Israelis militarily. But just the fact that you've got the U.S., that if you're going to go with war with Israel, you're also going to go to war with the U.S., that really changes everything.
I can't believe it. I mean, you're not really going to go to war with the U.S. I feel like if the U.S. gets more involved on behalf of Israel, there's going to be an uprising in this country. I really hope so.
Yeah,
I just don't see how
but we're
anybody
not there
can.
yet. And again, I mean, it's just like we're getting just. We're providing unconditional full support to Israel. We are completely complicit in all of this. There's absolutely no pressure for Israel to change its policies whatsoever. Quite the reverse. We're just saying if you want to ethnically cleanse Gaza, we'll back you up. That's your choice.
I can't. Yeah, it's sick. It's really sick. Something that scares me is just Trump's just sort of maybe megalomania. Maybe not megalomania is the right word, just or maybe the God complex that's in him, because he said something regarding the Ukraine war, saying that I hope to be able to get into heaven by ending this war. It's like, okay, great. Ending a war is a good thing, but I have a feeling when it comes to Israel, he feels like fighting a war for Israel might get him into heaven. And I'm feeling that he's having this idea and he's thinking about it in these big sort of grand picture of himself, almost like as if he's the second coming, because he had that tweet from Mike Huckabee as well, just saying how like God gave you a purpose, you survived that assassination and you're here to do great things. And I just kind of feel like the Zionist have got him, and I mean, he already is a Zionist, and so he believes in just maybe fulfilling this biblical prophecy that of Zionism, this heresy that's there, and And maybe he's thinking, I got to wind down the Ukraine war so I could focus on the holy war that I've been meant to do.
Right.
That's
Well, yeah, maybe in a sense, he's not a Christian Zionist per se, and he's not a religious person. I think that's clear. But he's a Zionist. In a way, it doesn't really matter. The secular Zionists and the religious Zionists, Jewish Zionists and Christian Zionists can all be equally devoted to the Zionist project.
Yeah, but he's thinking about heaven, and he's thinking about he's old, right. So he's going to grasp. And if he doesn't have a found Christian founding that is solid, he might just he's around Zionists. They're going to feed him the Christian Zionist version.
Yeah, it may not be Christian Zionism, but it's just Zionism according to Trump. It's the God Emperor as the anointed one to to achieve the ultimate goals of Zionism.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you almost have to frame it in that way, because how else can you? I don't understand how anybody can justify what's happening in Gaza, any politician, unless the only way that they do it and what they try to do is just say that this is evil. This is a bad. These aren't humans. They are just an evil plague on the earth, and then you put it in that kind of biblical sense almost. I mean, I feel like that's the only way you can possibly do it. Without losing your humanity.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's again. We know that Israeli leaders, including Netanyahu himself, have used and continue to use that kind of language. And many Israeli, including prominent Israeli citizens, whether they're secular or religious, use that kind of language. You don't have to use that kind of. You don't have to be actually religious to have that belief. Again, that somehow these are subhumans and not worthy of life. Again and again, Netanyahu uses this language of civilization versus barbarism, and they're the barbarians, and it's apparently that the children there are barbarians too. Again, the Israelis, including I point out there was this prosecutor in Nevada, an Israeli American citizen, that she actually posted. It was just like later they looked at her record of postings on tweets and found that she had made that. Again, there are no innocents in Gaza. That's a common refrain within Israel, and she said that and she said specifically including the children. So they are fair game. I mean, unfortunately, that is the way that many Israelis, again, polls show really that a majority of Israelis think that they are, they're not fully human, and we have a right to kill them. They're all evil. They're all tainted by by anti-Semitism or something, and they need to be killed. I mean, it seems like a really extreme, wild statement, but that's what the polls show, and that's what the conduct of this war shows. We just got the statistics again. 83% of those killed, and that's probably an understatement. Are civilians.
Right. Yeah, that's according to Israel itself.
Right.
83, the most moral army in the world, as they say. 83% civilian deaths, according to them. Yeah, I think that Nevada case with the Attorney General is an interesting one to happen when it did after the Epstein case. And people are looking at the relationship between Israel and the United States, and a lot of people are questioning, why it seems like Israel has a lot of influence over here in America. And then you have this case where you have an Israeli citizen that is the Attorney General of Nevada that lets an Israeli that is in the Netanyahu cabinet that's committing war crimes, that has that is charged with cybersecurity, that comes here and is arrested in a pedophile sting, on the backdrop of the Epstein stuff, and then he's just released. It just, I think the timing is perfect in this sense. It just, everybody is noticing. And it just, even, do you know who Megyn Kelly is? I know you don't watch mainstream news.
Right, I know who she is. Yeah.
Right, but she's like the conservative evangelical woman, the Zionist, basically. She's been hardcore Zionist. She's a conservative evangelical white woman. And that's her audience. She had Marjorie Taylor Greene on, and Megyn Kelly's doing some noticing. She's just saying, they were trying to get me to go here, and she admitted my perception of Israel has changed now. And she's somebody that's always just been hardcore in that camp. And then the response from the Zionists, people like Mark Levin immediately say, drop her. Or there's all this huge drive to say that she's being paid by Qatar and all these NGOs, and she's being funded by Hamas. And it's just, she's very still pro-Israel, but she's saying, like, there's something weird. How come, AIPAC is not registered as a foreign agent? They have this undue influence, and everybody, all of my colleagues are being told to go on this tour to Israel and to say these things. She's even saying it. Like, in my mind, that's a huge breakthrough.
Yeah,
like,
no, it is.
Her audience, or all her audience, they're all Zionists. They're all pro-Israel, or they used to be. And I think a lot of people are they're having this cognitive dissonance in their mind, and as evangelical Christians, and they're figuring things out.
I think that's right. That's there are cracks in the facade, and it may come crashing down at some point. I think it will. It's just a question of when. But those are all very encouraging signs. And again, it's like on the left, it seems like the battle has already been pretty much won, at least among the younger generation. The older leftists, maybe no, they just have to pass on. But the younger leftists have almost completely rejected Israel. But the encouraging thing is that you're seeing real signs of this happening on the right too. And it seems like, eventually, and maybe not so eventually, but in the near future, Israel is going to lose the entire younger generation, left and right. And then it's you say, okay, maybe you can hang on to power for a while, but just because the establishment, is still in your pocket, but this cannot last. It's not sustainable. I mean, again, it's just that the perception of Israel has changed so radically, and again, throughout the world and among the younger generation, but even in it's getting through to people like Megan Kelly, and that is encouraging. Now, they still have a ways to go, I know, but it's encouraging. You would have thought that maybe a year ago you wouldn't have heard any of this, but now it's happening.
No, she's been, really going after, protesters on campuses and these people. She's been very much on Israel's side. So hearing her say that was huge to me. I'm just like, things are changing. But you think there would be this realization within Israel that even if they do successfully ethnically cleanse all of Gaza, they have forfeited their future because of this, because they've lost the world. Do they not have a recognition? Do they not understand that they rely on the United States completely to survive, to do all their things? It's just the hubris that they have to just be able to do this with our money and not even care about what we think and what we say, and how they're dragging our country, our name through the mud, and we're all tainted now with this horrific genocide, and having to see these pictures of these starving kids. This is what how could they think that we would be okay with this? And that don't they understand that, they need to keep us in their good graces, and they just don't care?
Well, I think they all understand that they really do depend on the U.S. Netanyahu understands that. I think even Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and all those people understand it. But they have, I guess it's a big part of it is this hubris. They've had this unconditional support for decades, and they've come to see it as just sort of an immovable fact. It's just like the U.S. will always do what we tell them to do. I think that they've started thinking that way. It's just reflexive. There used to be a caution, like, okay, we can't really overstep our boundaries. We can't be too obvious, whatever. We got to be careful in the kind of rhetoric we use. That was the older Israel. They did terrible things, but they were cautious about it. They understood that it was that they needed to constantly protect and improve or repair their own image. After when things went wrong and occasionally some bad news came out, they worked really, really hard to try to provide explanations and, if necessary, apologies. And it was just like a bad apple or whatever, a mistake, and we'll learn from it. But now that's all gone. Again, we've seen it. It's we've seen it happen, just even during the course of, the last nearly 2 years since October 7th, there has just been this growing recklessness on the part of the Israelis. It just seems like they've thrown caution to the winds. They don't care. They don't try to hide anything. Well, they lie openly about the starvation, but they don't really even work all that hard at it. And I think you can only explain it by a kind of extraordinary hubris and a sense of entitlement. And it's just like there's just this, and I think it's just a product of, again, decades of this unconditional support. There are many times in the past where they felt like we got to be careful, we might lose the Americans, but the Americans, no matter what, always supported them. And I think that's led, in good part, that explains why they're behaving the way they are now. But it's obviously quite a mistake. And there are some of the older generation of Zionists recognize that. I think even Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, and some former generals have really rung the alarm bells and say Israel's in serious, serious danger now. And he said, we got to stop this right now, or Israel's never going to recover from this. They understand the damage that's been done to their reputation, but it seems like the younger generation in Israel just doesn't even seem to understand it. They just have the sense of invulnerability, invincibility, but that's a mistake.
How much longer do you see this going on in Gaza? I mean, we're coming up to 2 years pretty soon. Is it just? I mean, how long do we have to watch this genocide unfold?
Right. Well, this Gaza City operation, which I believe they're called, has been named Gideon's Chariot 2, is supposed to extend into 2026. And I think they're calling up 60,000 reservists for the first phase. The idea is eventually they're going to, fairly quickly, they plan to just completely level the city and well, if so-called evacuate the residents. First scare them away, those that don't respond to the evacuation orders, to start firing artillery until they run. And then if they don't run, they'll just be buried in the rubble. I think that's what's going to happen. The whole city is supposed to be reduced to rubble. That's the plan. And then there's going to be a period of several months where they're just like trying to completely destroy Hamas's infrastructure, which is largely underground. But that's going to go on to 2026. And then I don't know if there's a plan to do anything, what the next stage is going to be. But that's the current state. I think it is really to completely ethnically cleanse northern Gaza. And then we'll see. And then, there are efforts to find someplace overseas for them. I don't know that those will bear fruit there. The Egyptians have very strongly stated recently, and I think, in fact, to send troops into the Sinai, even against, in violation of a treaty that they had with the Israelis. Now, it must be said the Israelis have already violated the treaty by cutting off, or taking control of the Philadelphia corridor, right along there, the border between Gaza and Egypt. But the Egyptians have now sent troops because they're afraid that the Israelis are going to try to push the Gazans into Egypt.
Horrible for these people. They can't believe they're just trapped in this hellhole. And then nobody's helping them, and they're just being starved to death. Artillery shells, airstrikes, snipers, machine gun fire.
I have to say the Egyptian government is to a great extent complicit in this. They've condemned what Israel has done, but
I would expect that people in Egypt would just rise up. I mean,
right.
It's just when you see such unspeakable evil right next door, I feel like you have a moral obligation to fight it.
Right.
And I'm kind of surprised that I know Hezbollah has been very brave, but
I don't understand entirely. Of course, the Egyptians had their own uprising back in 2011, and they did have elections, and it was a Muslim Brotherhood government was elected, but then that was overthrown. And I think after that, it seemed like the spirit of resistance within Egypt was crushed. And so I'm sure there's a great deal of anger, but maybe there's also an equal or greater amount of despair and just sense of helplessness there.
Yeah, it's so sad talking about Gaza. I just don't. I just can't believe that we are where we are and nobody's done anything. I mean, you and I, we've both been to the West Bank on separate occasions. But just my interactions with Palestinians, they're so nice. They're just very, even though they're living in hard conditions there in the West Bank, they're just such nice people, and they have every right to live. I just don't understand how we've been able to demonize just such a, just people living on their land that they've lived forever, and they can't, and they're just being slaughtered, and nobody's helping them.
Yeah. Oh no, it's true. One thing is just observing, firsthand the lives that they live there. We're talking about the West Bank again, and this was several years ago. It's now much worse, but even back then it was very, very bad. Roughly 15 years ago, 14 years ago that I was there. I found myself thinking, yeah, I might have become a suicide bomber living under these conditions. It's really horrible. I mean, it's amazing that not more people just crack, snap.
Right, right.
Yeah,
They want to say, like, oh, they're all terrorists. It's amazing how pacifist they really are. How they really take a lot. They turn the other cheek so many times, and then one person after their brother's killed or their home gets taken throws a rock, and then they say, oh, look at these terrorists, and they throw them in jail forever.
yeah,
And just going through these checkpoints, the constant humiliation, it's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Israel is, there's no redemption for it. I just,
no, yeah, I'm afraid not. I think society has gone past the point of no return, and in the end, yeah, I don't know. It's just like however you look at it, it's not going to be pretty how it ends.
do you
But
think
yeah,
that, how much longer do you think it will go on before there's, but basically what we're hoping for, I don't know if we're hoping for, but I mean, when we saw Iran go strike Israel, I think, yeah, everybody was just like, okay, finally somebody's intervening and doing something, and it stopped. And now it's just this weird waiting game. And you're just wondering, like, is that what we need to hope for? Is we just got to wait for Iran to come back in and teach Israel a lesson? I mean, but do we have to wait until they kill a million more people or something? Like, what's...
yeah, I don't know. I guess I had to admit that I take absolutely no pleasure in the deaths of any Israelis. But just when I saw the buildings being hit, it's just like finally they're having at least suffering some of the consequences of their own actions. They ought to. This is something hopefully that can wake them up and make them maybe at least proceed with more caution in the future. That's in the end like nothing. Maybe that's the only thing that will cause Israel to maybe pull back, conceivably. But again, there are a lot of crazies there in charge of the government. If they feel like they're starting to lose the war, then they may look at the nuclear option. That's a scary thing.
Yeah.
That's the truth, So I just be careful what you wish for. I just don't.
I know, but I just feel like this is the end conclusion that's happening, and it's just so awful that we have to watch this genocide unfold before our eyes until it happens. Because I think I have a feeling that Trump is trying to end the war in Ukraine so he can pivot to Iran and focus on Iran. I saw that there was a U.S. general was just fired because he had a report that went out that said, "Hey, the Iranian nuclear sites weren't destroyed," and Trump just fired him. But this story won't die. We said what we were going to do is just completely obliterate their sites. I think we'll find out that's not. There's going to pressure to build back up from Israel to strike again. Right, so we're just building that up again, and then meanwhile in the background we're just watching a genocide in Gaza, just more and more children starving to death every single day until the inevitable clash. I feel like with Iran, and then Israel is starting to really collapse and suffer, and then they start setting off nukes. That's where we're headed, and it's almost like I'm just tired of waiting. I almost need to fast forward because this is what's going to happen no matter what.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I wouldn't say that's what's going to happen no matter what, but there is a real chance of it. I mean, again, I think there is a real chance that that's the road we're going to go down. That, again, this war between Israel and Iran is going to reignite. I think both sides are expecting that it will. There's talk within Iran, kind of interestingly, say that this time maybe we should be the ones to strike first, because you have kind of an advantage when you strike first. You know, again, Israel took advantage of Iran. You know, launched a stealth attack and caught him by surprise, caught him napping, and did a great deal of damage during that first day or two. And the Iranians, at least there's, talk within Iran. I don't know if there's anybody, decision makers are really seriously considering this, but they're saying that, maybe this is how we should retaliate. We shouldn't wait to get to suffer another surprise attack. Maybe we should be the ones that launch it. But both sides are gearing up for, I think, the next phase of this war. Again, like I told you about the $3.7 billion in U.S. aid, a lot of that is just to replenish those interceptor stocks that were drawn down during the 12-day war. And then there are reports, it's not clear, exactly what the Iranians are doing, but I guess the most recent report saying that they're getting a lot of help from the Chinese, and I guess a certain amount from the Russians too. I don't know, exactly what the proportions are. Of course, the Russians have their hands full in Ukraine, so it may be that this is a place for the Chinese to step in.
Yeah, I wish I would see some moves from China and Russia, India sanctioning Israel. I mean, at least throw in some economic muscle, to put some pressure on them.
Well, like India has actually had kind of has tended to tilt towards Israel. Now that may be changing. It probably is. Again, Russia had pretty good relations with Israel. They didn't really tilt to them. They've always supported the Palestinian state and that kind of thing, but they tried to be as neutral as possible. But after October 7th, they found that not to be possible, and they have, relations between Russia and Israel have certainly suffered. Have become much less friendly. But last I heard, anyway, that's India. Probably within the BRICS, India is the most Israel friendly. But as we can see, even those countries and individuals, that used to be lean towards Israel or were even strong Israel supporters, have begun to move away from that position.
Okay, Dad. I think we can end it there.
Okay.
Yeah, we're living through history right now, and we are on the wrong side. Our countries are. So I think it's very important that while we're living through this history, that you speak out against it and show that when you look back, tell your grandkids what you did during this time, that you weren't part of this, you spoke out against this, that this is not okay. This is something evil that's being done on our watch. So everybody keep on speaking out. That's all we can do. Okay, Dad. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.